This is the first Prospect Weekly Roundup of 2025. Sounds weird even saying that date. Ooh, hold on one second. Okay. Sorry, I had a short problem there, but I'm good. Here we are. Prospect Weekly Roundup. As I said, this is the first of 2025. I'm David Dayen, the executive editor. With me is Harold Meyerson. He is our editor at large. First, just a little sort of housekeeping. Last year, at the end of the year, we engaged in a fundraising campaign. The goal was to raise $75,000, and we hit that goal. So I want to thank everybody who donated and helped us tell stories about ideas, politics, and power. That was really great of you to do. The second thing that I should mention is that I am currently in Palm Springs, California. I sometimes live in Los Angeles, California. Harold is a native of Los Angeles, California, and the bulk of our roundup this week is obviously going to be about these terrible wildfires that have hit the West Side, which is, well, it's hit numerous places, but the biggest of the fires is in Pacific Palisades. The evacuation zone ends about 5 miles north of my house in Los Angeles. That's somewhat safe, but certainly too close for comfort. And Harold has an even more immediate set of reactions to what has gone on based on his past history, which maybe you can tell us about, Harold.
Well, I lived in LA except for when I was going to college for the entire second half of the 20th century. And the current evacuation zone is about, I don't know, 300 or 400 yards from the house where I grew up. I grew up in this somewhat bizarre uh, lefty upper middle class enclave surrounded by what was then non-lefty upper class Brentwood, and it was in the hills above Brentwood. I could explain that, but it would take the entire hour, I think, to do that. So just take my word for it. And when I was in fifth grade at Kenter Canyon Elementary School, we were all suddenly evacuated because of what was then called, or wasn't, it didn't have a name yet, the Bel Air Brentwood fire, which had started in Bel Air, and the winds were so great that it jumped the 405 freeway, the San Diego freeway, as it is often called, which was then almost completed, but still under construction. But it was a huge area where there was, nothing but dirt and machinery and concrete, and it skipped that and went over into the hills of Brentwood. That fire, to put something in proportion here, that fire burned almost 500 homes, and for a long time, that set the record in LA for most homes burned in a fire. What we now know about the Palisades fire is that it has gone beyond 500 to 5,000 structures built. And as was
Right.
not the case with the Bel Air Brentwood fire, a lot
With
of those structures,
another, just to stop you, with
yeah,
another 5,000
right,
in the Pasadena, Altadena area in the
indeed,
Eaton fire. So
indeed,
we have two fires that are 10 times as destructive in terms of structures
right.
as what was the most destructive fire in Los Angeles history.
And unlike these past wildfires, which we can get to a little later on, are actually routine in Los Angeles, just not at the
Right.
scale of the current one, to put the current ones. Uh, Unlike the earlier fires, these fires reach down into commercial areas.
Right.
Previously, the kind of wildfires we've seen in the hills of LA pretty much stayed in the hills, which are usually, somewhat overgrown with chaparral, with dry bushes and dry grass and dry trees. What we've seen in this past week is wiping out commercial districts, which is a new one for Angelenos.
Yeah.
In the Bel Air Brentwood fire, that fire came within about 300 yards of my family's house. Uh, and it really only lasted a day, a hell of a day, but we couldn't stay there that night, obviously. It was the zone was still quarantined. Returned the next day, and my 11-year-old, when I was 11, what I remember from the subsequent 2 weeks, in addition to having had some friends who had lost their homes, was that it was like living in an ashtray. It was an
Yeah.
experience that nothing remotely comparable before or since in my life. But
Yeah.
now there's a huge number of Angelenos. Well, they can actually return, as we were fortunate to do. But the ashtray aspect has spread to, parts of the city where people do still live.
Yeah, most of the city. In fact, as the weather patterns have shifted, I'm gonna have to. I need to go back, so we're gonna have to go back on Sunday. So I'm expecting that aspect of it to color our experience. I why I haven't been there for a little while, and I haven't experienced this yet. I know a lot of people that have evacuated. The strangest story is that I have a relative who lives in Pasadena, and they evacuated to the husband's parents' house, which happens to be in Sylmar, which was the site of another fire. So they literally fled one fire to only find another. I know people who have had their houses destroyed. I know people who have had to evacuate, including the parents of a member of our staff, Luke Goldstein. The fish restaurant, the Real Inn, which I brought my then girlfriend and now wife to meet my parents way back when, has been destroyed. Will Rogers' home or ranch house, I believe, in
Yeah.
Will Rogers State Park has been destroyed. And this could have been a lot worse. I mean, there was a fire in the Hollywood Hills that was making its way down the mountain. And fortunately, because the fire conditions there were a little bit better, the helicopters were able to get in and contain that fully. But the evacuation zone had gone all the way down briefly to Hollywood Boulevard. I mean, Grauman's Chinese Theater was in the evacuation zone. I think it's called TCL now or something. The Hollywood Bowl was threatened. This could have, as bad as it is, this could have been worse and could continue to be worse because the winds kicked up again last night, and they are set to kick up a little bit more next week. And in your piece that you wrote about this, you cited Mike Davis's Ecology of Fear, and which really, there was one chapter in there that talks about sort of the evolution cycle, the life cycle of fire in the Santa Monica Mountains in particular. And maybe you could talk about that.
Yes, Mike had written a almost universally acclaimed book about Los Angeles called City of Quartz in the late 1980s. And in 1998, he published, or whoever it was, Metropolitan Books, published his next book called Ecology of Fear, which focused in on LA apocalypse as a genre of fiction. He unearthed about 70 movies and books that had dealt with this. But also, chapter 3 was called The Case for Letting Malibu Burn. And it's a brilliantly researched chapter, but which begins before there were, Europeans in California. The Chumash and Tongva Indians did controlled small burns in the Santa Monica Mountains because every year, because they knew that the whole place could go up. He looks into Richard Henry Dana's classic 1826 work 2 years before the mast, and the first time Dana sailed up the Pacific coast off California, he noted that he saw a fire in Topanga Canyon. And then Davis unearths a fact that between 1930 and 1996, 2 years before the book appeared, there were 13 fires in the Palisades, Malibu area that consumed more than 10,000 acres. I mean, so there were a lot more fires that consumed less than 10,000 acres. And what that suggests, which should not at this juncture come as a surprise, is that the very terrain, the dry, overgrown hills of the Santa Monica Mountains, when combined with another regular feature of Los Angeles life, which is the Santa Ana winds coming in dry from the desert, make fire in the hills not the fault of Gavin Newsom, not the fault of Karen Bass, but is actually a normal feature of Los Angeles life. What's happened in the last week is simply that the winds have been much stronger than even normal Santa Ana winds, and the fires therefore spread more quickly and over a greater amount of terrain.
And actually, to give more context to that, the combination of overgrown, dry and overgrown vegetation. So just to give context there, 2023 was actually an incredibly wet year in California, and the winter of 2023, 2024 in particular. Since that point, since about, I guess, February or March of last year, it has not rained at all. So the combination of those two things meant that there was a lot more new vegetation that was up on the mountain, and yet it was all drying out through a period of hundreds of days of no water. And this is just unbelievable amount of kindling for these kinds of fires. And then the winds, shooting the embers from one place to the next, that creates the spread. And that's what we've seen. We still don't know the cause of this fire, but given what we know about California wildfires, given what we saw in, for example, the Camp Fire in Northern California, I would certainly not be surprised if this had something to do with power lines, something to do with sparks from an electricity substation or something of that nature, because that's just what we've seen in a lot of these circumstances. And I hope that, we can talk about the pros and cons of actually rebuilding in this area, but the reality is we probably are going to, since houses in Pacific Palisades are something like $2 million on average. It's an attractive place to live. But I hope in the aftermath, we really give a ton of consideration to burying the damn power lines so that we don't have as much risk as we do when they are exposed to the elements.
Yeah, I should add that I referred to in 1961, my grade school having been evacuated. It was evacuated again this week, as was my junior high school, Paul Revere.
Yeah.
And my high school, which when I went to it was new, Palisades High, either, substantially burned down. Some of it, I guess, remains, some of it doesn't. But, this was, the Palisades was where I hung out with my buddies in high school in the 60s. I took you have where you took your wife Mary to meet your parents. I took several dates to Will Rogers, which was a nice place to have a picnic on the grass and then a hike on hills from which you could see the entire LA basin and the offshore islands, as you could from any number of homes in Pacific Palisades. And as an old showbiz buff, Will Rogers' house was really a treasure trove of all kinds of things. It's hard to appreciate what a significant figure in American culture and even American politics Will Rogers was until his death in a plane crash in 1935, kind of briefly a combination of Johnny Carson and Walter Cronkite in a certain sense. Anyway, all of that is gone, and most of the commercial Pacific Palisades, where I once hung out in my youth, is gone as well.
Yeah. We had a question in the chat about, speculating on the future of Mayor Karen Bass. There was some unfortunate timing where she was actually in Africa when this conflagration sparked, and then she quickly got back into town. But there's been just sort of the height of what I think to older Jewish men like you and I would call chutzpah uh, from the person of Rick Caruso, who, of course, was the runner-up in the mayoral race when Karen Bass was elected. And Rick Caruso, for those who don't know, is a billionaire mall developer, essentially, who has taken this opportunity to go on television repeatedly and complain, probably in advance of another shot at the mayor's office, complain about the infrastructure, complain about the water system, complain about not being able to get water out of fire hydrants. And there are a few things to say here, and I'll let you respond after that. First of all, the way you get water into Pacific Palisades, which is on the top of a hill, you don't like just have a hose that you stick in the Pacific Ocean or something. You build water tanks, and they are giant water tanks, and they were all filled to the top when this started. But those water tanks and our infrastructure in general is optimized for a couple of fires, not the entire city or neighborhood of Pacific Palisades going up in flames at the same time. And it's really rich to hear Rick Caruso, who was the head of the water board in Los Angeles, who never said boo about whether or not we have enough water to handle, an all at once fire in Pacific Palisades, to talk about this. And the second bit of the chutzpah here is that when he's talking about fire hydrants going dry, which they may have temporarily, he's talking about the fire hydrants that he plugged his private firefighters into to save his mall and not the houses across the street. And indeed, if you go to the Palisades now, Rick Caruso's mall is just about the only thing left standing because he could afford to hire a bunch of people to protect it rather than everything else in the town. So this is just such arrogance, and I think chutzpah is the best way of putting it on the part of Rick Caruso. So I don't even want to begin to talk about his nonsense. In addition to the nonsense, put forward by places like Fox News about budget cuts to the LA Department of Fire, which are untrue. The cuts, such as it were on one-time expenses that you don't do year after year after year. And indeed, the LA fire budget was increased by $50 billion in after the final budget request went in. And then we can get into the other stuff and the fever swamps about DEI hiring at the fire department and all this nonsense. But the right wing is certainly trying to paint a picture of incompetence where it's really a picture of the effects of climate denialism over the last weeks and months and years and decades.
Well, it's the effects of climate denialism, and it's simply, even in more basic ways, the effects of development in terrain, which Mike
Right.
Davis warned us, and the Chumash Indians warned
Yeah.
us,
We
was
had about
prone,
thousands of years of
was
that.
prone to conflagration, and so that's a real issue. And of course, Rick Caruso is now in the company of Donald Trump, who has blamed California Governor Gavin Newsom for all of this. And really, in a sense, this is about like blaming Newsom and Bass, et cetera, for California earthquakes.
Right.
this is an
Right.
inherent feature of what California is. Unfortunately, the other inherent feature of what California is that it's been a very attractive place to live. Perhaps no place more so than the Palisades, which generally is so close to the ocean that it's cooler in summer, that a lot of the places have spectacular views. That it was, a really very nice community. It's a community, I should add, which is like sort of the rest of the American economy, gone more upscale, although it was always somewhat upscale, since I was a high school student there.
Right.
When I was a high school student, the Palisades Highlands, which is pretty much where the fire started, did not exist. But in the several centuries since I was in high school, uh, there have there was a development of still swankier homes higher up in the hills. And, the higher you go, you're exposing more and more
Yeah.
terrain to being both inhabited and in a danger zone. And that's what we
But
have seen here.
yeah, but I would say that there also is, about 180 or so trailer park in the Palisades, which I
Yes.
believe has been there for some time.
Yes,
And
it's right off the coast highway. My parents actually had some friends who retired there. High Weintraub was a really good labor historian, and they
mhm,
retired to this trailer park, which is just above the coast highway, and
right,
that's gone.
that's all gone. And
Yeah.
that was an example. And some of the homes sort of along the highway, because the fire jumped the
Yeah.
highway. Some of those homes were small apartments and things like that. So it's
Oh, yeah.
not exclusively Billy Crystal's house,
Right,
and
and there
Paris
were
Hilton's house.
yeah, and there are apartments in the Palisades too, sort of close to Sunset Boulevard, which was the one
Right,
commercial strip in the
right.
Palisades. And so yeah, and look, I mean, as I had mentioned when I was in high school, there were homes in the Palisades, flatlands, some of them, in a very fancy neighborhood, some of them, sort of ordinary homes in an ordinary neighborhood. All of that, regardless of
Well,
class, is now gone.
I mean, the question I think is, and this is a multifaceted question of, what is going to be the interest level, even of people with the means, to rebuild in a community that has now shown themselves this vulnerable to a potential disaster like this. And what does that mean more generally? I mean, we have seen over the last few years an outmigration from California, particularly from the California coast, because of home prices, because it was just too expensive to live in this area. And it wasn't the rich people who were fleeing; it was people who served those rich people fleeing to the outlying areas, fleeing to the Inland Empire, or even leaving the state entirely. And the question that I have is, to what extent is this recognition of vulnerability going to dampen demand to such a degree that it might turn around some of those home price strains in the Los Angeles basin and make things a little bit more affordable? It's certainly not the way we want to make things more affordable. It's not like a strategy or anything, but I think there's a reality. And the second part of that reality is, to what extent are some of these areas going to become uninsurable? That, I think, is the bigger question that will change sort of the landscape in Southern California. If you can't write an insurance policy on a particular patch of land, you can't write a mortgage to it, and you can't build there essentially. And so that, I think, is the larger question.
And this doesn't affect just the Palisades. There's in the dry hillsides surrounding the LA basin. You don't just have the Palisades, you have West
Yeah.
Hollywood, you have Beverly Hills, you have Bel Air, you have Brentwood, you have Encino, you have Sherman Oaks, you have
Keep
Tarzana,
going.
yada yada yada.
Yeah,
You have uh, you know,
including
place.
the places that burned, like Altadena and Pasadena,
Yes,
and there
yes,
was one near Studio City.
right.
All of those, yeah,
Yes, yes. Once you get out of the flatlands, you're talking about a real swath of the city, and it's the swath disproportionately where houses cost more, which have a more upper middle class to upper class resident base. Well, I mean, David, I would, so this raises huge questions, not just for the immediate areas that burn down, but for all the areas that I think are in similar danger of this
yeah,
kind of fire. But initially, this is LA is uh, very much one of the premier cities in the country that's plagued with homelessness. People who are quite wealthy are gonna, come out. They will believe me, will not be on the sidewalks. But this is going to cause more disruption, and it is the fact that house insurance rates in California, which are already at record levels, are going to go up even more.
yeah.
Is I mean, you're right. Is going to make that's one thing that's going to make the cost of living rise, even as perhaps the depreciated value over the long term of hillside residency will bring some of that down. So
Yeah.
it's a mixed picture, but none of it is good.
We have a question here talking about this insurance controversy from a user named Just Passing Through. I read that 4 months before the winds hit, insurance companies canceled and cut fire insurance. Is it possible that insurance corporations knew the government would pick up the tab? Well, there's a complicated set of issues here. At one level, yes, there were some insurance companies like State Farm and others who were not renewing policies, including in the Palisades and other areas, or attempting to increase rates as much as 40%. And obviously, there was a back and forth with the state insurance commissioner over some of that stuff. Now, there is a sort of insurer of last resort
Yeah.
that exists. It's called the FAIR policy that you can buy if you are unable to get private insurance for your residents. However, that particular government-based policy is going to run out of money fairly quickly, and when it does run out of money, by the statute, private insurance companies are asked to kick in to cover any of those insured losses. And what we know right now is that insured losses are going to be as much as high as $20 billion, and that's only an initial assessment. And we know that Fair has, I think, 600 million. It's not going to bear all of those insured losses, but it's going to bear a pretty hefty chunk. And what that means is that that chunk is going to be spread across all insurance companies in California. So it doesn't matter where you live. Your insurance company is probably going to be affected by this, and it will respond presumably by trying to increase your insurance rates. And so there's and insurance rates. I mean, I know from personal experience, insurance rates in California have been skyrocketing over the last 2, 3, 4 years. So even though there's this sort of safety net from the government, that's not really a safety net from the government, because once it runs dry, it falls back on the insurance companies. And so this gets into a piece that I put up on the website today, which talks about the exquisite timing of the big banks, which decided to basically roll back their climate commitments in an attempt to cozy up to Trump, right in the same week that we're seeing these blazes all over our television screens. And the connection between those fires and extreme weather events more generally and big banks is it's a pretty clear connection. So if an insurance, I mean, there are not a number of ways. If a homeowner in the Palisades loses their home entirely and only gets back a portion to that, and they had a mortgage on it, they're going to have to write off the mortgage. They simply don't have the money to pay back the loan on that, and the bank is not going to see their asset. If a business in the Pacific Palisades goes under and had a business loan, the bank is going to have to take that loss. And more fundamentally, if insurance companies are straining under the weight of all of these losses from climate change, not just in California, but in Appalachia and in all the other places in the country that have had extreme weather events, Florida and North Carolina, then if you get a collapsing insurance company, we know from the 2008 financial crisis exactly how that can cascade through the financial system and affect the biggest banks in America. We saw it with counterparty risk, where AIG, the big insurance company, went under because it was doing credit default swaps, and every company with whom it was doing those was exposed to that risk. If an insurance company starts to collapse and starts doing a fire sale of its assets, these are highly diversified asset managers, essentially. If it starts, fire sale of its assets, and those assets are then priced permanently lower, and you have a big bank that was relying on those assets to be higher to make its balance sheet, then there's another risk. So, I mean, I've sat here and just listed 4 or 5 or 6 different risks that banks have. And this is why it wasn't sort of optional for banks to decide, okay, we're only going to fund investments and lending that are net zero, that do not increase carbon emissions. That wasn't an optional thing. That was for their own financial survival. But the problem is that Donald Trump and the Republicans consider that ESG investing, which is like the devil, and that that interferes with the free market, and they don't want any of that to happen. And so the banks, all one by one, the 6 biggest banks in America pulled out of this thing called the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which was put together by the UN, that said we will have our lending and investment portfolios that they would not contribute to any further carbon emissions on the planet. By pulling out of this, these banks are showing their hand. They're saying, Trump is mad at us if we pull this, and so we're going to allow more fossil fuel investment. We're going to allow more carbon emissions to be on our portfolios, and we're seeing in real time the potential financial consequences of that decision by the banks.
And 2 points. I should add that I think there was a Wall Street Journal editorial today, which in classic Wall Street Journal editorial form was decrying that there is this public backup system, which you described in California, for insurance as a drain on taxpayers' money, which should be left entirely to the individual. And of course, as you just pointed out, what's left to the individual redounds at this scale redound across the entire insurance industry and then the entire financial system. And the story of AIG, which no one was following, no one outside of a relatively few people in the financial community were following in 2008. Suddenly, this insurance company, which none of us until then had heard of, was linked to every major bank in the country, every really large bank, and the government had to move in and effectively take it over, which, to put it mildly, was hardly on the agenda of the George W. Bush administration at the time. But these things cascade, and we don't. I should add, the Republicans in particular do not appreciate all the links that you just laid out, David.
And I can tell you that tight connectivity, which was a major factor in the 2008 crisis, has not changed. I mean, you go to the balance sheet of any major insurance company in America, and you'll know that they're systemically significant, that they have ties to every major big bank in the US and abroad, for that matter. And when the U.S. catches a cold, the rest of the world gets sick. So this is a global issue, and it's a larger issue about how the insurance industry should really be on the front lines. They should be the ones marching in the streets. It should be insurance executives marching in the streets for a stronger effort to deal with climate change, because it's their dollars and cents on the line here.
And look, we're seeing a version of this certainly in other regions of the country that are exposed to ever greater climate catastrophes. And Florida is a prime example of that. I mean, this is very politically different states, but states that are also have been at the brunt of what climate change is doing. So this isn't just a California problem, and as you mentioned, David, even with climate change, we can get the effects of hurricanes in Western North Carolina, which was not exactly considered the front lines of endangered regions of the country. But what does that say then about the future of insurance rates just about anywhere?
I was talking to someone the other day in Atlanta telling me there's the first ice storm there in 100 years. I mean, the big problem is that we have a 20th century infrastructure for a 21st century climate, and it's completely mismatched. We are not, to the extent that in Southern California, we just aren't ready for all the homes in Pacific Palisades to go up in flames at once. We are also not ready for extreme cold in places like Atlanta or Texas, where we saw the electrical grid fail a couple of years back. We are not ready for hurricanes in places like North Carolina and Appalachian, inland North Carolina. Here in Palm Springs 2 years ago, there was a hurricane. This is a new kind of situation. Now we have another follow-up question here. Are the banks protecting themselves against the necessity of bailouts now? What would Trump 2.0 do if banks started to fail? That's a very interesting question. Certainly, there was a backlash to the 2008 bailouts on the right populist side of things. That's kind of one of the things that spawned the Tea Party. But I would suspect, given the caliber of people who Trump has put in place at the Treasury Department, National Economic Council, they're very bank friendly. And I think there would be no compunction against bailing out the banks if there was one of these kinds of situations.
Well, look, we had just within the last I guess 18 months, the main bank for Silicon Valley.
Yes, Silicon Valley Bank, yeah.
Right. And it was because of who the depositors in that bank were, which is sort of, let's say, Elon Musk's social circle. It was guaranteed, every depositor was made whole by the guarantee of the government.
Right.
Even
though, and that bank in particular, the limit on FDIC insurance is $250,000, and there were people in those banks with tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars in their account because they were using them to pay payroll and do things like that. And they weren't brokering the accounts in any way to maintain safety. And what happened to Silicon Valley Bank is actually what could happen to other banks if they were suddenly faced with insurance collapse. Silicon Valley Bank had certain assets that higher interest rates made less valuable and less profitable, and they didn't manage their balance sheet risk to the degree that they needed to hedge against those interest rate increases. And so, just like that, an unanticipated collapse of a major insurance company would be surprising to a bank balance sheet that may rely on that insurance company being healthy. So it's a very similar situation. And yes, just as it played out in a Democratic administration and a Federal Reserve that has a lot of support for the banking industry, So would it, I believe, for a Republican administration and that same Federal Reserve that's in line with the banks.
Yeah, we should note that there was no right-wing backlash as there was in 2008 to the bailout that I know. Was there of Silicon Valley Bank? I didn't see much of
Well, I
one.
mean, the tech right was all for it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's
And it was done. I mean, it wasn't as big as the '08 collapse, right? I mean, it
right.
wasn't. It certainly wasn't the same kind of situation, but it was a very niche bank that happened to cater to an emerging tech slash defense slash venture capital right wing. That it was the very kind of people that seem to whip up the right wing frenzies were not interested in whipping anything up with regard to Silicon Valley Bank.
Exactly. And from Elon Musk to Andreessen Horowitz, et cetera, those people are going to be a force in Republican politics and the Trump administration. So
100%.
yeah.
And we'll have more to say about that in the coming weeks. Maybe we'll switch topics here. I know you wrote this week about a decision that was made by the Biden administration, one of the last big decisions that they made, which was to cancel this proposed merger between Nippon Steel and U.S. Steel. Could you take us through the contours of that and what happened in that case?
Yeah, well, I should say that the moment this was announced, well over a year ago, I said, politically, there's going to be a problem just by virtue of the names of the two companies. I mean, this is Japan taking
Right.
over the United States, if you want to translate Nippon. But what was going on here was that U.S. Steel has been something of a having less of an economic profile, obviously, than it once did, and the entire American steel industry has been undercut by foreign imports, particularly from China, where the government subsidizes the steel industries and subsidizes them to the point that they can go to rock bottom prices with which not just American steel, but other developed nation steel have trouble meeting. So all of that said, there was a bid to take over U.S. Steel from a company called Cleveland-Cliffs, which is really something of a unicorn in that it is a union-friendly major American company. And obviously, the steelworkers union thought that that was a good deal, but it certainly didn't appeal to the CEO of U.S. Steel, who had gotten to a point where he just loathed the union, and a bid that was somewhat more generous came in from Nippon Steel, but that raised various questions. Now there is the sort of the national question as to how much of the sort of a basic industry like steel is to be controlled by domestic companies. Cleveland-Cliffs obviously is a domestic company. Nippon obviously is a Japanese company, but that is not really what concerned the steelworkers. What concerned the steelworkers was that they were wary about the guarantees from Nippon Steel that the factories where their members worked would be kept open, wouldn't be reduced, continued investment would go into those factories. And there were two factors, I think, that really kind of stopped the union from supporting the deal. One was that the amount of capital that Nippon was pledging to invest over a 2-year period in U.S. Steel turned out to be pretty much identical to the amount that U.S. Steel was taking in depreciation on its plants, on the unionized plants, which is to say, simply by maintaining and fixing the existing machinery, not updating anything, Nippon Steel could meet that commitment. The second, even more troubling aspect became clear in a agreement that Nippon Steel reached with the interagency governmental body, which rules on the purchase of major American companies by foreign companies, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., or its acronym CFIUS, CFIUS. And in its agreement with CFIUS, Nippon Steel wrote that if there's any labor action, like picketing, like a strike, even like a lockout, which is, of course, initiated by management, not by the workers, that would be grounds to abrogate, to negate, to throw into the wastebasket all of its pledges that it had made about keeping plants open and so on and so forth. That was a rather obscure element of that agreement with CFIUS that almost passed unnoticed until the last few weeks. And so, a large bell started ringing and a red light started flashing to the union, which had really not wanted this deal in the first place. Now, this left the Biden administration somewhat divided. There were folks who believed that Nippon Steel commitment would still be good, and therefore there might be more money available than there was from Cleveland-Cliffs and so on. But there were an equal number of high-placed Biden administration folks who said, no, this is just not a good thing. And of course, I should add that Donald Trump had condemned the deal on nationalistic grounds to begin with. So in the end, Joe Biden did like the Union Maid in the song about the Union Maid did. He stuck with the Union. I'm sticking with the Union, says the song. And that's what Biden did, which really kind of is in keeping with his conduct in the White House of backing unions. And the larger issue here, really, the larger issue, because this is, CFIUS's mandate is to rule on the such matters on the basis of national security, and the
Right.
Biden security advisor Jake Sullivan apparently said, "Look, this doesn't affect national security." I maybe have a more expansive idea of national security. I don't know, particularly given the changes we've seen both here and in the other advanced other democracies with advanced economies. I don't really think that we're all that secure absent a vibrant union movement that could sustain a middle class.
Right.
And my sense of national security would lead me to think that no, this is not a deal which enhances national security, just as a proliferation of low-wage, non-union jobs in general has, produced an electorate that I think willy-nilly is endangering national security in a more political way.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's even a narrower way you can look at the national security question around, okay, if this new combination changes its structure so that there are no blast furnace steel production facilities in the United States, which is the steel that happens to go into ships and goes into aircraft carriers and goes into things of that nature, then that is dangerous to national security all by itself. And
Yes.
it doesn't matter exactly who the whether or not the company purchasing it is headquartered in an ally. There was this sort of boomlet within the Biden administration to talk about what they call friend shoring, which is only doing trade with allies rather than with countries that might be antagonistic, like China, for example. And so on those grounds, I think a lot of people saw, well, Japan is an ally. Nippon Steel is headquartered in Japan. This should fall into the friend shoring category. But there's a different conception of it when it actually deprives state support for and homegrown industry in the kind of things that are critical to national security. So,
Yeah,
so
there,
I,
there,
I, I that's the way I see it too. In addition to your absolutely true argument that having a stratification between rich and poor is bad for national security as well.
Yeah, and there are really two kinds of steel mills. The older kind still use the blast furnaces, which produce the kind of steel which does go into, really heavy structures and shipbuilding. But those are, the ones that remain are largely unionized. Other steel mills, such as those of Nucor, which is a non-union domestic steel company, use electric arc heating instead of blast furnace heating, which is very good for producing certain kinds of steel, but not the kinds of heavy steel that you referenced, David. And U.S. Steel has a non-union plant in Arkansas, which does use the electric arc technology.
Right.
And there's been a fear from the union that both U.S. Steel and Nippon might want to eventually, or sooner than eventually, close down the unionized plants, which are mainly in the old industrial Midwest, and go to the lower wage electric arc plants in places like Arkansas, which would not be a great development for, as you mentioned, the Navy.
Right, exactly. All right, we have about 10 minutes left. I want to shift because we're now at January 10th, and the inauguration is in about 10 days. The new Congress is already underway. It started last Friday. On Monday, we saw the certification of the election. The only real legislation that is moving right now is this thing called the Lake and Riley Act, which is an immigration bill that would be rather punitive, even to people who are accused of crimes, not even convicted of crimes. And Democrats have decided to go forward with advancing in the Senate, advancing work on the bill. They have not committed to closing off debate. So we'll see what happens on that next week. But what I'm fascinated by, and I wrote about this week, is that Republicans don't yet have a strategy to pass their agenda, let alone a good sense of what is in that agenda. So because of the silly ways in which we do governing in this country, before you know what you're passing, you have to know how you're going to pass it. Because there's this gatekeeper effect with the filibuster in the Senate, and there are only a few ways around that. And the main way is the budget reconciliation process, which is a 50-vote process, but which you only get one budget reconciliation bill per year. And it also has to conform to a bunch of parameters. It has to be budget related rather than just policy related. So the question has been, are Republicans going to do two reconciliation bills, one for this fiscal year, 25, and one for next fiscal year, 26? Or are they going to wrap everything they want to do into one big, beautiful bill, as Donald Trump called it this week? And they haven't figured that out yet. It looked like they were going to do one bill because Donald Trump endorsed the one bill strategy, which would put everything around the expiring Trump tax cuts, funding for border security, changes to energy policy, and the like, and somehow an increase in the nation's borrowing limit into one bill. And if you think that sounds daunting, you're right. The other option was to do a two-bill strategy where you just get a quick win by adding some border funding, which would presumably fund the mass deportations that we might see, and just get that done, get that off the table, and then work on taxes the rest of the year. But Trump first rejected the two-bill approach, but then everybody in the Republican caucus said it's not decided yet, and we're still working on it. We're still figuring it out. So they haven't even decided what they're deciding on, right? They haven't even decided to decide, yet alone the detail.
Part of the problem is we can view as a matter of both magnetic attraction and magnetic repulsion. The idea of including, crackdown on the border and deportation is meant to attract every Republican who might stray
Right.
from backing an
I
omnibus bill.
can't vote against that.
On the
Exactly.
other hand, magnetic repulsion refers to things like raising the debt ceiling or not slashing government enough, which would drive away, the hard right Freedom Caucus, which wants their entire wish list or nothing. And so
Right.
they have these two, components which are completely at odds in terms of building the support they need. They're only going to have, I mean, there's a couple members of the Republican House delegation right now who will shortly leave because they have administration positions they will assume. And that would get down the number of Republicans in the House to 217, with against 215 Democrats. They only have that 53 votes in the Senate. And so, they're juggling with completely opposite completely
Right.
opposite aspects of this bill and in terms of its ability to win or lose
Right.
unanimous Republican support.
And they kind of can't get out of the starting gate on it. And so, I think the general belief of Democrats is that, well, there's no way that Republicans will miss an opportunity to extend the Trump tax cut. Like, if they can do anything, they will extend those. And the way you sort of in the early days here are looking at this thing, you have to ask yourself, really? Like maybe they can. Like, yes, we can bungle the Trump tax cut extension because I think that what you just outlined, the competing priorities, and then you delve into the details, right? And there's Republicans in high net worth communities who want to eliminate the state and local tax deduction, what is known as SALT. There are Republicans who have even talked about raising corporate taxes, while others have talked about slashing corporate taxes. There are all the Trump, you get a tax cut, you get a tax cut promises that he made during the campaign. And there's also this rump faction of Republicans who want to make sure that any bill is deficit neutral, even though they're trying to add something like $5 to $7 trillion over a decade of tax cuts. So where are they going to get the offsets for that? It is a confounding set of problems for a caucus that, let's not forget, 2 years ago had trouble keeping a speaker and couldn't really pass anything without Democrats helping them. And now their majority in the House is even smaller than it was 2 years ago. So I think that if Democrats stay together on this and they continue to message, that there is a strong possibility that the legislative ambitions in the early going here do not get realized. And that doesn't mean that Trump can't be a disruptive force. A lot of the stuff that Trump's going to do has nothing to do with Congress, has nothing to do with legislative action. But it does mean that some of the big things might not be able to get as much progress as we think.
Well, there's no distraction like an armed occupation of Greenland. I
Indeed.
mean, he can dominate the discussion with other initiatives. God
Oh,
forbid.
absolutely. And
Yeah,
that's why I said, yeah, I mean, it's not that the danger is lifted, but it
right.
is something worth watching. All right. We are out of time. Harold Meyerson, editor at large, American Prospect, thank you for being here, for talking about your history in Los Angeles. Obviously, our hearts go out to anyone who's been affected by this. And there are a lot of places you can go on the internet to see where the evacuation sites are, what help is available to people, whether it's with pet storage and rescue, or being able to store their belongings, things like that. I've read a lot about that. Duty Watch is a great app to keep the latest on the fires, and we'll still be covering it, of course, at the Prospect. We will be back next week at 12:30 Eastern, 9:30 Pacific, with another edition of the Weekly Roundup. And until then, we will see you. Thank